Okay, so something truly unbelievable just happened. For the very first time in modern history, the United States military has captured a sitting head of state, Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, and has actually flown him out of his own country. So how do we get here? Why now? And maybe most importantly, what on earth happens next? Let's get into it.
All right, let's start right where the action began, with the pre-dawn raid that absolutely shook the world. So, picture this. It's Caracas, the Venezuelan capital, in the dead of night, early hours of Saturday morning. The city's asleep, it's quiet, but that is about to change. Big time. And then, boom, explosions start rocking the capital. Turns out it's a surprise U.S. military operation. We're talking about a really complex mission, with nearly 200 American personnel hitting the ground. Official reports are even confirming that at least one U.S. helicopter took ground fire. So, despite injuries, the mission pushed forward. Then, just as the sun was starting to rise, the White House drops this absolute bombshell. President Trump announces that not only Maduro, but also his wife Cilia Flores are in U.S. custody, and they're on their way to New York to stand trial. The entire world was just left scrambling.
So the big question on everyone's mind is, how could the U.S. possibly justify such a radical move? Well, the answer is in a legal case that Washington has been carefully building for years.
The entire official reason from the U.S. hinges on this one very powerful term, narco-terrorism. See, according to the indictment, this isn't about going after a head of state. No, this is about arresting an individual who they accuse of leading a massive criminal enterprise, one that partnered with violent drug traffickers to flood the United States with cocaine. And when you look at the specific charges, they are really serious. The Justice Department is claiming that Maduro himself was the head of something called the Cartel of the Suns, basically a network of high-ranking, corrupt Venezuelan officials. The accusation is that they didn't just look the other way. They actually weaponized drug trafficking, using cocaine to harm the U.S., and then using the profits to keep their hold on power. Now, this framing is absolutely crucial to understanding the U.S. position. They're arguing this wasn't an act of war against the nation of Venezuela. They say it was a police action against a single indicted criminal. And they're drawing a straight line to the 1989 capture of Panama's Manuel Noriega to make their point. But of course, that is only one side of the coin. If you look at it from Caracas, the story is completely different. They don't see a law enforcement operation. They see this as the final act in a decades-long imperialist campaign by the United States to overthrow their government. To really get Venezuela's narrative, you have to start with this number, 99%. The government in Caracas says the country's devastating economic collapse wasn't because of their own mismanagement. They argue it was the direct result of a crippling economic war waged by the U.S., a blockade that completely wiped out almost all of their oil revenue in just 6 years. From their perspective, this whole thing didn't just pop up with the drug indictment. They say it started the moment Hugo Chavez was elected way back in 1998. They point to a clear pattern. President Obama declaring them a national security threat in 2015, which opened the door to sanctions, and then the Trump administration hitting them with a total blockade of their oil industry and seizing their most valuable asset abroad, the refining company CITGO. And this quote from Maduro himself really gets to the heart of their argument, that the U.S. deliberately engineered a humanitarian crisis to create the excuse for exactly what just happened, a foreign intervention designed for one thing, regime change. So we're left with two stories that just cannot both be true, a law enforcement action on one hand and an imperialist invasion on the other. So it's really no surprise that the rest of the world was just as divided. Almost immediately, major U.S. rivals like China and Russia came out and condemned the operation. Beijing called it a hegemonic act that tramples all over international law. And that's a feeling shared by a lot of nations that are nervous about unilateral American power. But if you look inside Venezuela, you got a totally different reaction. The opposition was celebrating. Leaders like Maria Corina Machado, who many people believe actually won the 2024 election, they called the operation a step towards liberation and even thanked President Trump for his firmness.
And this split wasn't just international. Back in the U.S., this thing sparked a political firestorm. Top Democrats were immediately out there condemning the operation, calling it reckless and a legal act of war done without any approval from Congress that could have some really severe unforeseen consequences. So all of this disagreement, all of this chaos, it all leads us to the biggest question of them all. What happens now? You know, the geopolitical analyst Frederick Kempe put it perfectly. He said the capture itself is really just the beginning.
The real question is whether this incredibly dramatic action is going to lead to any kind of lasting, stable change, or if the whole thing is just going to unravel into even more chaos. What's happening on the ground right now is a super dangerous power vacuum in Caracas. You've got Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, who was quickly sworn in. She controls the military and all the state institutions. But then you have the opposition leaders, Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez. They have massive popular support and what many around the world see as the legitimate claim to power after that 2024 election.
So, the best-case scenario here, the one held by the Venezuelan opposition and supporters of the U.S. operation, is that this finally breaks the political stalemate. The hope is that by taking the head off the authoritarian regime, it clears the way for the democratically elected leaders to finally take power and start to rebuild the country.
The pessimistic view, though, is a whole lot darker. Critics, including a spokesperson for the UN Secretary General, are warning that by seizing a head of state, the U.S. has set an incredibly dangerous precedent. They're worried it completely undermines international law, basically invites retaliation, and could plunge Venezuela into an even bigger, messier conflict, now that Maduro is out of the picture.
And that brings us right back to the one question that defines this entire event. Was this an act of justice, a necessary move to bring a criminal to trial and free an entire nation? Or was it an act of aggression, an illegal violation of a country's sovereignty that just made the world a more dangerous place? The answer is anything but clear. But the one that history eventually lands on will shape not only the future for millions of Venezuelans, but the very nature of American power for years to come.